Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of culinary passion, hidden truths, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Enjoy the story. In the bustling city of Chicago, the aroma of sizzling steaks and garlic-infused pasta wafted through the air of a cozy restaurant named Taste of Home. Inside, a man in his early 30s stood at the helm of the kitchen, expertly directing his staff as they prepared the evening's dishes. This was Steve Anderson, head chef and owner of Taste of Home. As he tasted a spoonful of sauce, his mind wandered to his childhood, growing up with his twin brother, Jack. "Perfect," Steve muttered, setting down the spoon. "Jamie, make sure you keep stirring that sauce. It's the heart of the dish." As the night wound down and the last customer left, Steve retreated to his office. He sank into his chair, exhaustion etched on his face. His phone buzzed. A text from his wife, Rachel. "Don't forget, we have brunch with my parents tomorrow. Love you." Steve smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He loved Rachel, but there was a part of his past he'd never shared with her, a part that haunted his dreams every night. Later that night in their cozy apartment, Rachel woke to the sound of Steve's labored breathing. He was tossing and turning, mumbling in his sleep. "Hold on, Jack, hold on." Rachel shook him gently. "Steve, wake up. You're having a nightmare again." Steve's eyes flew open, his forehead drenched in sweat. He sat up abruptly, disoriented. "Here." Rachel handed him a towel she kept by the bedside. "Same dream?" Steve nodded, wiping his face. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I didn't mean to wake you." Rachel stroked his arm soothingly. "Maybe it's time to see a therapist. These nightmares have been going on for years now." Steve shook his head. "I'm not crazy, Rach. It's just stress from the restaurant." He got up and headed to the bathroom. Rachel heard the water running and sighed. She knew there was more to it, but Steve never opened up about his past. When Steve returned, Rachel was sitting up in bed. "What do you keep dreaming about? You always cry out, 'Hold on,' and a name. Jack, I think?" Steve froze for a moment before climbing back into bed. "It's nothing, really. Just random dream stuff." Rachel didn't push further, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was a significant piece of Steve's life she didn't know about. As Rachel drifted back to sleep, Steve lay awake, memories flooding his mind. He thought back to his childhood in a small town in Minnesota, where he and his twin brother Jack grew up. From an early age, Steve had been fascinated with cooking. He'd spend hours in the kitchen with their mom, learning to make everything from pancakes to pot roast. Jack, on the other hand, had a passion for fashion and design. Steve smiled, remembering how their mom used to complain to her friends. "I've got one son who wants to be a chef and another who wants to be a fashion designer. How am I supposed to explain this to their father?" Despite their different interests, Steve and Jack were inseparable. They supported each other's dreams, even when others didn't understand. After high school, Steve went to culinary school while Jack studied fashion design. They'd call each other every week, sharing stories of their classes and adventures. The memory of their last conversation before the accident hit Steve like a punch to the gut. Jack had just finished his final year. Steve's mind drifted back to that phone call 5 years ago. Jack's excited voice echoed in his memory. "Steve, I did it! I aced my final project!" "That's awesome, bro. I knew you would," Steve had replied, grinning from ear to ear. "We need to celebrate. I've got an idea. Let's go hiking in the Rockies. A bunch of us are planning a trip. It'll be perfect before we dive into our careers. What do you say?" Steve had agreed enthusiastically. "You know me, I'm always up for an adventure." The trip started out perfectly. The group of 10 friends, including Steve and Jack, had been hiking for 3 days, enjoying the breathtaking views and the challenge of the mountain trails. On the 4th day, they reached a narrow suspension bridge spanning a rushing river. The group started to cross, 2 at a time. Steve and Jack were in the middle of the bridge when disaster struck. Steve squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the memory, but it played on in his mind like a horror movie he couldn't turn off. Jack had been a few steps ahead of him on the bridge. Suddenly, his foot slipped between 2 planks. He lost his balance, the weight of his backpack pulling him down. "Jack!" Steve had yelled, lunging forward to grab his brother's arm. For a moment, he thought he had him. Their eyes met, both filled with fear. Steve's grip was firm on Jack's wrist, but the swaying of the bridge made it hard to pull him up. "Hold on, Jack! I've got you!" Steve had shouted, straining with all his might. But Jack's hand was slipping. The others on the bridge couldn't move closer without risking the whole structure collapsing. "Steve," Jack's voice was eerily calm. "It's okay. Let go." "No, I won't let you fall," Steve had cried, tears streaming down his face. But gravity and fate had other plans. In a heartbeat, Jack's hand slipped from Steve's grasp. Steve watched in horror as his brother plummeted into the raging river below. "Jack, no!" Steve's anguished cry echoed through the mountains. The group had searched for days, but Jack's body was never found. The authorities eventually called off the search, concluding that Jack had likely drowned and been swept downstream. Steve shuddered, the guilt and pain of that moment still as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. He turned to look at Rachel's sleeping form, wishing he could share this burden with her, but afraid of the judgment he might see in her eyes. The next morning, Steve sat at the kitchen table, nursing a strong cup of coffee. Rachel bustled around, getting ready for their brunch plans. "Steve, honey, are you sure you're up for this? We can cancel if you're not feeling well," Rachel said, noticing the dark circles under his eyes. Steve managed a weak smile. "No, it's fine. Your parents are expecting us. I'll be okay." Rachel sat down across from him, reaching out to hold his hand. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? Whatever's bothering you, whatever these nightmares are about, I'm here for you." Steve squeezed her hand, guilt gnawing at him. "I know, Rach. It's complicated." Rachel sighed. "All right, but promise me you'll consider talking to someone. A therapist could really help with these nightmares." Steve nodded noncommittally. "Maybe. We'll see." As they left for brunch, Steve couldn't shake the feeling that his past was catching up to him. Little did he know how right he was. That evening, Steve was in his office at the restaurant going over the books. A knock at the door interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he called out. Maria, one of the cleaning staff, entered hesitantly. "Mr. Anderson, I found this while cleaning near the coat check." She held out a sleek, expensive-looking wallet. Steve took it, admiring the craftsmanship. "Thanks, Maria. I'll make sure it gets back to its owner." After Maria left, Steve examined the wallet more closely. It was clearly custom-made, of high-quality leather. He opened it, intending to look for ID, and froze. The wallet was stuffed with $100 bills. In a separate compartment, he found a photograph. His heart nearly stopped. The photo showed a man who looked exactly like him, kissing a woman Steve didn't recognize. They were standing in front of a mountain range that looked eerily familiar. Steve's hands shook as he stared at the image. It couldn't be. Could it? Rachel walked into Steve's office, excited about their evening plans. "Ready to go, honey? The art exhibit starts in an hour and—" "Steve? What's wrong?" She found her husband pale and trembling, clutching a photograph. "Steve?" Without a word, he handed her the photo. Rachel's eyes widened in shock. "Is this you? But who's the woman? And when was this taken?" Steve's voice was barely a whisper. "It's not me, Rachel. It's Jack." Rachel's confusion was evident. "Jack? Who's Jack?" Steve took a deep breath. It was time to tell her everything. "Jack was my twin brother." Rachel sank into a chair, her mind reeling. "Twin brother? But you've never mentioned having a brother, let alone a twin." Steve nodded, his eyes filled with pain. "I know. I'm so sorry, Rachel. I should have told you long ago. It's a long story." Rachel's initial shock gave way to hurt and anger. "A long story, Steve? We've been married for 3 years. How could you keep something like this from me?" Steve reached for her hand, but Rachel pulled away. "I think you'd better start explaining. Now." For the next hour, Steve poured out the story he'd kept bottled up for 5 years. He told Rachel about growing up with Jack, their different passions, and the fateful hiking trip. His voice broke as he recounted the moment Jack slipped from his grasp. "I watched him fall, Rachel. My own brother. And I couldn't save him. The authorities searched for days, but they never found his body. They said he must have drowned, been swept downstream. Rachel's anger had softened to sympathy. "Oh, Steve, I'm so sorry. But why didn't you ever tell me?" Steve's eyes were filled with anguish. "I couldn't bear to talk about it. My mom, she blamed me for not being strong enough to pull him up. She died of a heart attack 3 months later. I felt like I'd lost my whole family. I couldn't face the possibility of you blaming me too." Rachel moved to his side, wrapping her arms around him. "Steve, it wasn't your fault. It was a terrible accident." Steve leaned into her embrace, tears flowing freely. "But now, this photo, Rachel, if this is recent, it means Jack is alive. Somehow he survived. And he doesn't look like he's being held against his will or anything. He looks happy." Rachel examined the photo again. "We need to find him, Steve. Do you have any idea where this could have been taken?" Steve shook his head. "No, but I'm going to find out. I have to know what happened to my brother." Over the next few days, Steve threw himself into the search for Jack. He enlisted the help of a private investigator and scoured social media for any trace of his brother. Rachel supported him every step of the way, even as she struggled to come to terms with this newfound knowledge about her husband's past. "Steve," she said one evening as they pored over potential leads, "have you considered that Jack might not want to be found, if he's alive and hasn't contacted you all these years?" Steve shook his head vehemently. "No, there has to be an explanation. Jack and I were closer than close. He wouldn't just disappear unless something was seriously wrong." Just then, Steve's phone rang. It was the private investigator. "Mr. Anderson, I think we've got a lead. There's an up-and-coming fashion designer named Aaron Summers who's having his first major show next week. The interesting part? He looks exactly like you." Steve's heart raced. "Where?" "Right here in Chicago, sir. At the Millennium Park Art Center." Steve thanked him and hung up, turning to Rachel with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "We found him, Rach. We found Jack." The night of the fashion show arrived. Steve and Rachel dressed up and made their way to the Millennium Park Art Center. Steve's palms were sweaty, his heart pounding as they entered the bustling venue. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Rachel whispered, squeezing his hand. Steve nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I have to know, Rach. I have to understand what happened." As they milled around, pretending to admire the clothing displays, Steve suddenly froze. There, across the room, was a man who could have been his reflection. He was laughing with a group of people, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. "That's him," Steve breathed. "That's Jack." Before Rachel could stop him, Steve was striding across the room. He tapped the man on the shoulder. "Jack?" The designer turned, his smile faltering as he came face to face with his mirror image. The color drained from his face, and for a moment it seemed he might faint. I'm sorry, do I know you?" he stammered, his eyes wide with shock. Steve's heart sank. "Jack, it's me. It's Steve, your brother." The designer shook his head, confusion evident on his face. "I'm sorry, but my name is Aaron Summers, and I don't have a brother." A woman at Aaron's side looked between the two men, her face a mask of shock. "Aaron, what's going on? Who is this?" Steve felt Rachel's hand on his arm, steadying him. "I'm Steve Anderson," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And unless I'm going crazy, this man is my twin brother, Jack." The next few hours were a whirlwind of emotion and revelation. Aaron's wife, Sarah, suggested they move the conversation to a more private setting. They ended up in Aaron's design studio, an airy loft filled with sketches and bolts of fabric. "I don't understand," Aaron said, pacing the room. "I don't remember having a brother. I don't remember much of anything before 5 years ago." Steve leaned forward, hope blooming in his chest. "What do you mean you don't remember?" Sarah took Aaron's hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "Maybe I should explain. I found Aaron, or Jack, I suppose, 5 years ago. My family and I were on a rafting trip in Colorado. We spotted what we thought was a body caught between some rocks in the river." Steve's breath caught in his throat. Sarah continued, "But when we got closer, we realized he was alive. Barely. We pulled him out and got him to a hospital. He had hypothermia, a concussion, a broken leg, and amnesia." Aaron nodded, his eyes distant. "The doctors said I might never recover my memories. All I knew was that I could sew, It was like my hands remembered even if my mind didn't. So you named him Aaron and made up a new life for him? Rachel asked, a hint of accusation in her voice. Sarah shook her head. We tried to find out who he was, but there was no missing person report that matched. No ID was found with him. After months of searching and no leads, we helped him start a new life. We fell in love, got married. Steve was reeling. But why didn't you file a missing person report when you found him? We did, Sarah insisted. But it was filed in Colorado, where we found him. I guess no one made the connection to a missing hiker states away in a different time frame. Steve turned to his brother. Jack, Aaron, do you remember anything now? Anything at all? Aaron shook his head slowly, then paused. Wait, when you first called me Jack, something felt familiar. And looking at you, it's like looking in a mirror, but more than that, I don't know how to describe it. Steve smiled, tears in his eyes. Like you found a part of yourself you didn't know was missing? Aaron nodded, a tentative smile forming on his face. Yeah, exactly like that. Over the next few weeks, Steve and Aaron spent every free moment together, trying to bridge the 5-year gap in their lives. Steve shared stories of their childhood, showed Aaron old photos, and even recreated some of their favorite meals from when they were kids. Slowly, fragments of memory began to return to Aaron. A laugh shared over a prank they'd pulled on their parents. The pride they'd felt at each other's accomplishments. The day they'd decided on their career paths. I remember the bridge, Aaron said one evening as they sat in Steve's living room. Rachel and Sarah were in the kitchen preparing dinner. Aaron's voice trembled as he continued. Not all of it, but flashes. I remember the feeling of falling, the rush of the water. And your face, Steve. I remember seeing your face filled with terror as I slipped away. Steve reached out, gripping his brother's hand tightly. I tried so hard to hold on, Jack. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. Aaron shook his head. No, Steve, don't apologize. I remember now. I told you to let go. The bridge was swaying and I was afraid we'd both fall if you kept trying to pull me up. Tears streamed down Steve's face. I've carried that guilt for 5 years, Jack. The nightmares, the fear. I thought I'd killed you. Aaron pulled his brother into a tight embrace. You didn't kill me, Steve. You gave me a chance at survival. If you hadn't held on as long as you did, I might not have landed in a way that allowed me to survive the fall. From the kitchen doorway, Rachel and Sarah watched the emotional exchange, their own eyes glistening with tears. It's like watching a miracle unfold, Rachel whispered to Sarah. Sarah nodded. I've never seen Aaron, Jack, so at peace. It's like he's finally whole again. As the brothers pulled apart, Steve wiped his eyes and managed a chuckle. So, should we call you Jack or Aaron now? His brother thought for a moment. I think I'd like to be Jack again. Aaron was who I was when I didn't know myself, but Jack is who I really am. Steve grinned. Welcome back, Jack. Over the next few months, Jack worked on legally reclaiming his identity. It was a complex process, involving DNA tests, court appearances, and mountains of paperwork. But with Steve by his side, he felt he could face anything. Jack's memories continued to return, though there were still gaps. He remembered more about their childhood, their parents, and the life he'd left behind. Each recovered memory was like a gift, filling in the blank spaces of his past. One sunny afternoon, the 4 of them, Steve, Jack, Rachel, and Sarah, stood in front of a small headstone in a quiet cemetery. Mom, Steve said softly, we found him. Jack's alive. Jack knelt down, tracing the letters on the headstone. I'm so sorry, Mom. I wish you could have known I was okay. Rachel put a comforting hand on Steve's shoulder. I'm sure she knows now, and I bet she's overjoyed to see you two together again. As they left the cemetery, Jack turned to Steve. You know, I've been thinking, I love designing clothes, but I miss cooking with you. Remember how we used to dream about opening a restaurant together when we were kids? Steve's eyes lit up. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Jack grinned. A restaurant with a built-in fashion boutique? It's crazy enough it just might work. Taste and style, Steve mused. What do you think? I think it's perfect, Jack laughed. Sarah and Rachel exchanged amused glances. Well, Rachel said, I guess we'd better start looking for a bigger venue. As they walked to their cars, Steve felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The nightmares that had plagued him for years were finally fading. He had his brother back, a loving wife, and a new sister-in-law. Life, which had seemed so dark for so long, was now full of possibilities. Hey, Jack, Steve called as they were about to drive away. Race you to the restaurant? Loser has to wear the other's clothes for a week. Jack's laughter rang out. You're on, bro. As they sped off, Rachel shook her head, smiling. Some things never change, do they? Sarah grinned. Nope, and I wouldn't have it any other way. 1 year later, Taste and Style opened its doors to the public. The unique concept, a high-end restaurant seamlessly integrated with a boutique fashion store, was an instant hit. Food critics raved about Steve's innovative cuisine, while fashion magazines couldn't get enough of Jack's designs. On opening night, as the last customers left and the staff began cleaning up, Steve and Jack stood in the middle of their dream come true. Can you believe we did it? Jack said, looking around in wonder. Steve wrapped an arm around his brother's shoulders. We always said we would, didn't we? Even when everyone thought we were crazy. Speaking of crazy, Rachel's voice came from behind them. She and Sarah approached, carrying a large cake. Happy birthday, you two! The brothers grinned. In all the excitement of the opening, they'd almost forgotten their own birthday. As they gathered around the cake, surrounded by their staff and closest friends, Steve raised a glass. To second chances, he said, his voice thick with emotion. To family, both old and new, and to dreams that never die, no matter how long they're deferred. To dreams, everyone echoed, clinking their glasses. Later that night, as Steve lay in bed next to a sleeping Rachel, he reflected on the journey of the past year. The nightmares that had haunted him for so long were gone, replaced by dreams of the future, a future bright with possibility and rich with the love of family. He thought of Jack, probably lying awake in his own bed, mind buzzing with new design ideas. He thought of their mother and how proud she would be to see them now. And he thought of the long, winding path that had led them all to this moment. As he drifted off to sleep, Steve smiled. Life had thrown them a curveball, but they'd caught it and turned it into something beautiful. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together, as brothers, as family, as two halves of a whole finally reunited. In the quiet of the night, in a city full of dreams, two brothers slept peacefully, their lives once again intertwined, their futures bright with promise. And somewhere, perhaps, their mother smiled down on them, her boys finally home.